And welcome back to Face the Nation. Joining us now as we continue our 66-year tradition at CBS News, the end of the year Correspondents Roundup. Jan Crawford is our chief legal correspondent. Margaret Brennan covers the State Department. David Martin, our national security correspondent. On the other side of the table, John Dickerson, our political director. Nancy Cordes, our congressional correspondent, and Major Garrett, our chief White House correspondent. Welcome to you all. You don't look like you've been here 66 years. Glad to have you back. This is always one of my favorite things at CBS News, and I can remember when I was first at CBS News hoping they'd invite me to be at the table sometime, and it was a long time before they did. Let's talk a little bit about, well, let's just start with North Korea. Margaret, what are the president's options really when you come down?
This is like a bad movie about a bad movie, that you have Seth Rogen creating this international incident in some ways. But really diplomatically, the tools are limited. Most likely, you put North Korea back on a terror blacklist, a list they were taken off of in 2008 by the Bush administration in an effort to keep them going in what ended up to be failed nuclear talks. And along with that, you'd probably get more targeted sanctions directed at leadership. But keep in mind, this country is already very much sanctioned to the hilt. So
what about
limited.
Beyond that, David? Can we take some sort of cyber action? It seems clear to me we do have certain capabilities in that area.
The U.S. certainly has those capabilities. The question is, do you want to expose those capabilities on such a puny target as the North Korean infrastructure? You'd be giving away more in your techniques of how you conduct these attacks, I think, than you would be gaining. I think most people believe that the most effective thing you can do is go after the leadership bank accounts that are overseas. The Bush administration did that in 2005 and succeeded in freezing the accounts. And North Korea very quickly started to change its behavior enough so that the funds got unfrozen. Now, since then, the leadership has done a better job of hiding its bank accounts. But still, I think that is the surest way to make North Korea pay a price for what now the president has called not an act of war, but just an act of vandalism.
Well, what does that mean?
I can tell you, Bob, at the White House there was this sort of joke, speaking to David's point about cyber counterstrike. Well, we could attack the one North Korean computer. And then someone would say, well, yeah, the Atari computer, you know. So that does suggest that the White House doesn't really view that as a productive line of retaliation to go after them in a cyber way. This financial mechanism is by far much more important. But I think the other issue, whenever you deal with North Korea, you must deal with our conversations ongoing with China. And this becomes a front and center issue in everything that we do with China, economically, militarily, in climate. Every other conversation now, North Korea has injected itself unhelpfully into that conversation. That complicates things for China. And I will tell you, in the last 12 months, China has been more helpful than not in dealing with our concerns with North Korea. They're going to have to get back in the game.
John Dickerson, a pretty unusual thing for an American president to go after an American company as he went after Sony, saying they just kind of set a bad example here.
He was very forceful about that. He said he wished they'd talk to him first to give him a little presidential guidance on how to handle the issue, how to deal with their theaters. He said he recognized that the company had its own interests and legal issues, but it was very forceful in that press conference he gave at the end of the year, where he kicked off it was sort of emblematic of the entire press conference. He had a lot of theories about a lot of things. He was much looser than we'd seen before, and that was really one of the strongest examples of that, is his strong position.
How did all this go down up on the Hill, Nancy? Of course, most Congress was not here.
Right.
When we found out about most of this.
They were gone, but the reaction that we heard from lawmakers is, well, we need to do something. What that something is, there's absolutely no consensus, and I think lawmakers are going to want to know a lot more when they come back from the holidays about what the options are before they get behind one strategy or another.
What's this year going to be like, Jan?
I didn't think we're doing predictions till the end. I mean, if you look back, so much was surprising in 2014. What's 2015 going to be like when you're talking about North Korea, the president in this new posture? And I agree with you completely. He seems kind of freed now to do some things that he'd been talking about from the beginning, including closing Guantanamo, which I think it'll be really interesting to see how forceful he is with that. I mean, every candidate including going back to George Bush, has said they wanted to close Guantanamo. The president said that was one of the first things that he wanted to do when he took office. It's not so easy. And
well,
I don't know legally and politically how he could do it. I don't think he can.
Well, you know, Lindsey Graham has been one of those. What you heard what Senator Graham said this morning. He said, I think we ought to put more people down there.
And he was so forceful. If you look at that, what Senator Graham said to you, that's what you're going to see on the Hill. And going into 2016, Democrats, do you think Democrats are going to get behind the president wanting to send potentially 60, I mean, pretty serious terrorists to the United States?
I mean, what do you do with them if you close them down? I mean, that's the question. I mean, I think a lot of people...
we can't release about half of them.
Right. Yeah.
And we can't try them either because of either contaminated evidence or difficulties in presenting that evidence from a national security or classified perspective. So there is, as the president has said routinely, a real conundrum here. Where do you put them? How do you try them? Do you hold them forever? And if you do, in what way is that consistent with American judicial values?
But where you could make progress is on the dozens who have already been cleared for transfer. And that's what you saw just this weekend with the 4 Afghans who did go back to Afghanistan. And diplomats are working on this furiously, trying to resettle them, find a country who will take those who've been cleared of charges, or bring them back to the countries where they were taken from in the first place. And you are going to see large numbers transferred in the year ahead.
But I agree with that, but that still leaves about half. I mean, you're going to start talking about 60.
Yes.
Right, and so then it becomes, what do you do with those? I think the president will try to argue that it's just too expensive. You know, it's $2 million basically an inmate a year to detain them there versus bringing them here. But I don't think anybody's going to care. The polls show the American people are overwhelmingly opposed to this. Going into a presidential election, Democrats are not going to want to be on the, holding the banner of let's bring some terrorists over here.
Well, you know, speaking of things that are easier said than done, let's talk about the Cuban surprise here. The president says he's going to, reestablish relations with Cuba. Obviously, there's going to be considerable opposition from Republicans, but I think Republicans are going to face some hard choices here because here you have the U.S. Chamber of Commerce coming out strongly for this. You have the Texas Business Council. There's no more Republican state right now than the state of Texas, but all of that grain that we're already selling to Cuba as humanitarian aid, it goes through the port of Corpus Christi, Texas. And that's the main embarkation point for aid to Cuba. I think this is going to be something that's going to be debated, and I think it's not going to break on party lines.
It will, but I think at the end of the day, you still have far more Republicans in the House and the Senate who favor placing restrictions and keeping restrictions on Cuba. You do have Republicans from farm states and maybe more libertarian-leaning Republicans like Rand Paul who feel that, look, what we've tried hasn't worked. Let's open things up. But I still think, by and large, Republicans think we've got to keep restrictions on Cuba until we see some Democratic action. And most importantly, the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and the new Senate leader, Mitch McConnell, both oppose lifting the trade embargo. And as long as that is the state of play, I don't think you're going to see any vote to lift it.
You know, Margaret, my sense of it is that this came not only as a surprise to most people in Washington, but to a lot of people at the State Department.
Well, this is a policy that many diplomats would privately support and have for some time, though publicly were unable to. But you're right. I mean, having the foreign policy negotiations directed out of the White House, not the State Department, did ruffle a few feathers. That's fair to say. But I think the way to frame this, what's actually changed, when you talk to people at the State Department who are now going to be on the front lines of that, diplomacy is slow, it is deliberate, it is quiet. This is not about Americans getting on a U.S. airline and bringing back Cuban cigars to sell. This is going to be about, as you rightly said, the business community. That's who it's going to benefit up front. It's going to take another 6 months before we look at whether Cuba comes off that terror sponsor list, and then you might open up more sanctions being lifted. But this is really going to be about migration issues, smaller scale things than the way this is being framed right now.
David, what do they think about this over at the Pentagon?
Well, Cuba had long receded as a national security threat. So it's not like an opening to Cuba suddenly releases the Pentagon from some great burden of defending against an attack from Cuba. It was always just a nuisance value. So there was you know, it was a favorable development, but not a game changer in any way for the Pentagon.
You know what I thought was interesting about the president's end of the year news conference? Not a mention of terrorism. ISIS did not come up once. Syria did not really come up. Did immigration come up? I'm trying to remember. I don't think it did. It was mostly about Cuba. It was mostly about
and the irony is that these
Korea.
big issues came up right at the end of the year, so they kind of dominated the discussion. But I think in the new year, North Korea and even possibly Cuba are going to kind of recede because you've got really pressing issues. The president is going to want an authorization of military force to go against ISIS. That's going to be a huge debate. They're going to be talking about Iran. These are the foreign policy issues that are going to dominate.
And of course, the president wanted to put a bow, literally, on the economic year for the United States of America. And he feels very, very good about that. One truism about that, however, is that the economy improved and Washington had nothing to do with it, other than getting out of the way. Okay? None of the president's big domestic initiatives that he proposed in the State of the Union address got across the finish line. And yet the economy improved. Washington basically didn't scare anybody with the threat of a government shutdown or a default. And the economy, using its own means, its own moxie, and its own energy, created economic growth and jobs. And that's a telltale signal, I think, to policymakers in Washington about what you can and can't do and the limits of your own aspirations.
So the funny thing will be is how do they take in that lesson? Because you could see a way in which an improved economy means more money, more revenue coming in, which means you won't have to fight over scarcity in the way we've had it over the last several years, which could encourage more mischief, more efforts to try and actually get some things done. If the lesson of the last couple of this year is don't get in the way, they're still all going to be pushing to try and get in the way. And the president will be trying to keep the economy, his legacy is now so tied to that economic upswing as it continues.
And the next big aspect will be trade.
Excuse me, I have to clear my throat. So we're going to take a little break here and we'll be right back.